Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. Mike Talbot, ready to present to you our webinar for this afternoon on conflict and mental well-being. You're very welcome to join us today. I see we have lots of people on, both from the UK and from around the world, for our webinar this afternoon. So let's crack on. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. There'll be a chance for question and answer along the way. My name is Dr. Mike Talbot. I'm the founder and CEO of UK Mediation, and I'm a psychotherapist by trade. So I come to this field from a career as a psychotherapist, private practice for 11 or 12 years, working with people with all sorts of mental health issues, and also borrowing the lessons from psychotherapy and bringing them into the field of mediation. So my particular take on the subject is thinking about the psychology of conflict, why conflict's so difficult, why we get into conflict, and what it is that we need in order to move on from our disputes and bust-ups. So, quick overview of our webinar this afternoon. I'm going to be looking at what we mean by mental ill health as a consideration of what we mean by mental well-being. And then talking about this notion of capacity and mediation. We hear this word quite a lot about whether people have the capacity to participate. And I want to unpack that a little bit and think about in some detail what it means to have the cognitive or emotional or psychological capacity to be able to take part in mediation. And then I want to talk about what we can do as mediators to address and be inclusive with people with various sorts of psychological predicaments. So talking about what we can do as mediators, and then talk about some bit more detail about the tie-up between mediation and mental well-being, in effect the two-way street between needing support to go through mediation or the kind of psychological predicament that might lead you into dispute whereby you would have to try and avail of mediation. So that's where we are. There'll be a chance for a Q&A at the end, but also we like to encourage you to chirp up during the presentation. So if you have any comments or questions as we go along, you're very welcome. There's a chat box in YouTube. Post your comments, post your questions. My colleague is on hand as well. There'll be a couple of links that we'll put in the chat box for you as we go. But we appreciate and value the interactive nature of doing these webinars live. So let's begin. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by mental ill health, and by implication what we mean by mental well-being. So I'm going to tap into a number of panels here on the presentation. First of all, thinking about what we mean by mental ill health. Well, we hear a lot of labels, as ever. There is some value to the labels, there are some limitations to the labels as well. We hear about stress or stress-related illness. To my mind, stress is simply sort of an imbalance between your resources and demands. So generally speaking, a prolonged over-demand on somebody's personal resources results in stress or stress-related illness. Anxiety, there's a sort of a characterization of anxiety where there's all this spare energy waiting to latch on to something. There's this higher degree of arousal. When we are anxious, we find it hard to sleep, to relax, to concentrate. And then also thinking about depression. Depression is, contrary to popular belief, it's a whole range of things, but it tends to be characterized either by low mood or a lack of energy or a dysphoria, a difficulty in enjoying yourself or engaging with the world and the people in it, and a lot more we could say about depression. And then there are phobias or obsessive behaviour, which can affect somebody's demeanour, somebody's ability to interact, somebody's ability to engage with the world, somebody's self-image and self-esteem. So just a few of the labels that are commonly thrown around, and I'm going to refer back to these in a moment. In time-honoured tradition, we have a few statistics for you. So 75% of people in a survey recently, we go for the most recent surveys. A lot of surveys have been on hold during lockdown, but in 2019 a Personnel Today survey found that 75% of people reported that instances of workplace conflict had affected their mental health. So we'll just concentrate on that for a second. That's 3/4 of people who were polled and there were several thousand people in this poll, said that workplace conflict had impacted on their mental health. That's highly significant, and it shows just how deeply these things go. So we think that people having tiffs at work and falling out with colleagues can be brushed off. It apparently doesn't get brushed off, according to that statistic. 25% of people say that they have taken time off during the period surveyed by Personnel Today in the same survey due to poor mental health. So people's mental health is causing them to take time off. A quarter of the people polled said that they had had to do that, take time off due to poor mental health. These are high figures. These are extremely significant. These are pre-pandemic. I'd be curious to see some comparative figures during the period, you know, from March 20 till round about now. I think we might find it goes even deeper. However, let's sort of relate all of that, really. These ideas about different sorts of mental ill health, different compromises to people's mental well-being, the high incidence of statistics there about how many people are affected both by conflict and have to take time off. And let's have a think about this notion of capacity. So quite often, when we at UK Mediation get referrals of cases for mediation, we have to, well, we always meet people individually, we have a chat with the referrer, we get some basic information. There is a consideration around whether the participants have the capacity to take part in mediation. So they may have had an occupational health assessment, they may have been assessed by a psychologist or somebody from their employee assistance programme as to whether they have the capacity to take part in mediation. And this would be for people who have perhaps had prolonged mental health issues or who've been off with one of the types of mental ill health that I've described right at the beginning there. But I just want to unpack this notion of capacity. What do we mean by capacity to take part in mediation? I think if we're too blunt about this, we might say that if anybody scores highly on the depression scale, then they shouldn't be allowed into mediation. If anybody has a significant obsession or compulsion, they shouldn't be allowed into. I don't agree with that at all. And I think, for a start, I think mental health issues are very phasic. They come and go. So you may have good days, bad days. I think the second thing is that unless we understand the sort of functional basis for mental health issues, then we can't be making any blanket decisions about people's capacity. So let's think about this notion of capacity and think about what capacity parties taking part in mediation need to have. So the question I'm answering here is, what do you need to be able to do in order to make the most of or to take part in mediation and be able to avail yourself of the benefits of mediation? Capacity. So one thing is you need the capacity to know that another person might feel and think differently to you and be having a different experience to you. So just dwell on that for a second. So there are, in many situations with many individuals, that capacity is temporarily or chronically compromised. The ability to know that somebody else is having a different experience to me. Just think about that. There may be people that each of us knows, either at work or otherwise, who perhaps we couldn't say that is true of, that somebody is quite wrapped up in their own experience, in their own position in the world, their own experiential space, as some people would call it, and wouldn't have this notion that somebody else might feel or think differently to they do. You also need to be able to listen and to understand somebody else's description of how they think and feel. And again, this might be difficult for some individuals that I'm sure all of us could think of. And also to know this sort of cause and effect, this sort of what I would call dialogic cause and effect, to appreciate that the other person's thoughts and feelings could be affected by what I do and say. That's an interesting aspect of how we relate to people. And some of us, some of the time, either forget or don't have or simply can't get in touch with this notion that this person that I'm talking to could be affected in their thoughts and feelings by what I do and say. And we would say that, loosely speaking, the incapacity to do that would arise from sort of stress and stress-related illnesses. It could arise from all sorts of predicaments, absolutely all sorts of predicaments, including being on certain medications, including having certain physical illnesses. But loosely speaking, stress and stress-related illness would compromise our capacity to be able to do those things I've just talked about. So we're thinking about who would be able to take part in mediation, what would be the psychological predicament of somebody that would be prevented from taking part in mediation. And here's the first nugget. that all of those things might be made more difficult by stress or stress-related illness. Let's think of another aspect of capacity. So in taking part in mediation, you need to be able to imagine that things could be different to how they are now. You need to be able to imagine that things could be different to how they are now. You would need to be able to reason that your actions and your choices could influence how things might turn out. It's this notion of industry, or the notion of cause and effect. So yes, I believe things could be different. Yes, I believe that what I do and the choices I make could affect how things turn out. And also to believe that you're entitled to a better future. I think there's a deeper, if you like, an existential angst in some people that they don't actually believe that they're entitled for anything better to happen to them than is currently happening. So if we put all those things together, and again, loosely speaking, because there could be a broad spectrum of things that lead you to not have this capacity, but they could be all made difficult by depression or low self-esteem. So we would suppose that if somebody is depressed or has a sort of a chronic or temporary lowered self-esteem, then they wouldn't be able to do those things. They wouldn't have the capacity to do those things and thereby to engage successfully in mediation. Let's have another one, a capacity really to understand what the process is about. So we're away from those deeper, more existential, more reflective and emotional aspects, more into sort of thinking aspects of a person's predicament here. So the capacity to understand what the mediation is and what it's for, the capacity to be able to discuss topics in turn, so to be able to pick something and discuss it with a colleague with the help of the mediator, and do this with a mixture of listening and speaking. So being able to listen and being able to put your points across and to be able to pick a topic and talk about that. I think anybody taking part in mediation would need to be able to do that, to get the most out of the process. And then to appreciate also that there is an agreement that could be reached and that this could be arrived at by virtue of the two sides' discussion. So the notion of give and take, the notion of being able to pool our thinking, and that within the process we've got to be able to come up with an agreement that may be arrived at by virtue of our discussion. And the last bit on this slide really is to abide by an agreement and expect the other person to do the same. So the psychological capacity to know that an agreement can be reached through dialogue, to know that this is something that I will make my best efforts to abide by, and to know that the other person will endeavour to do the same. And if we can do that, then again, in terms of that aspect, we would be able and would have the capacity to take part in mediation. But this is all made difficult by anxiety disorders. So somebody who's very anxious, the notion of discussing one topic in turns with a mixture of speaking and listening, the notion of we are going to reach an agreement and it's going to be okay, and I'll be part of the agreement and you'll be part of the agreement, and the notion that I will try and stick to it and probably will, and you'll try and stick to it and probably will. That actually can feel quite out of reach for somebody who's in the depths of an anxiety disorder and who is unfortunately more distracted by and overwhelmed by anxiety than would lead them to be able to take part in mediation. So there's quite a few ideas about what I think we mean by the notion of capacity. So when people talk about does X have the capacity to take part in mediation, that would be some of my thinking around whether they will actually be able to participate and get the most from mediation and make it a worthwhile endeavour. And of course we're not mentioning everything there, there's more to talk about, but I'll skip over aspects of if somebody had psychotic illness, that's a whole different area. If somebody had a learning disability, or if somebody was on the autistic spectrum or had Asperger's syndrome, again a whole another topic, and whether somebody had a personality disorder. So none of these things are considered necessarily here in this webinar, but they are highly significant things that would dispose somebody better or worse to be able to make the most of mediation. Okay, so that's to do with capacity. I've talked about what mental ill health is. I want to talk about now about what we can do. So as mediators, what do we do? as I say, my own background in psychotherapy, I've worked a lot with people with mental ill health, with stress, anxiety, depression type disorders, as well as other things. You don't need to be a therapist to be a mediator. It's helpful to have a bit of insight into the predicament of people who do have any of the things I've talked about, but also who have any degree of mental ill health. And a lot of people, a lot of us, some of the time, will suffer some mental health issue. So it's not uncommon, and I don't wish to suggest that there's a them and us here. There's people who get mental illness and people who don't. I think it's a very phasic and it's a very widespread phenomenon. But I think what we can do, there's a few tips here. One of the first things I think is important is to appreciate that one size does not fit all. I can't give you a formula here, and there's no textbook that could give you a formula to say, yeah, just do this with people with stress, just do this with people with anxiety. It doesn't work that way. And what you've learned on a different occasion or from working with another client may not work today with this client. So be very careful that we're not being formulaic about this, about thinking we have the answer for people, working with people with stress or working with people with anxiety or working with people with depression. It doesn't work that way. And I think the danger is suggesting how you know it is, suggesting that you know how it is for them. That can actually make things worse. So feigning empathy or supposing that we are able to be empathic with or to identify with an individual's mental predicament is a real risk in that. There's a lot to say about empathy, there's a lot to say about identification, there's a lot to say about the notion of what I think is helpful, which is to try and put yourself in somebody's shoes. Okay, I'm not saying we can always do it, we can't always do it. It's impossible to be continually empathic. It's sometimes said that it's impossible to be empathic at all. It's only an endeavour. It's only something we can try to do. So try and avoid saying you know how it is for someone. I don't think we do. And with my experience of working with people with mental ill health, I wouldn't want to patronise people by saying I know how it is for you. I don't. And it can make things worse. So be careful that we're not being formulaic, be careful that we're not feigning empathy. And try and learn a bit about the kinds of challenges that somebody with mental health problems has to face. Try and understand from them what it's like for them and how their ability to interact, their ability to relate is affected by their psychological predicament. And I think for us to get on board with that and to make this effort to understand that person's reality, it can actually help in the mediation process. And I think for us to build empathy with an individual, it helps that empathy. I'm not suggesting there's something magical happens here, but I think there is something almost out of our awareness that does go on. For us to build empathy with individuals helps those individuals to build empathy with one another. And I think it's an important aspect of working with interpersonal mediation. That we lead with empathy. And I think once you get even a bit of empathy or a bit of psychological contact, as I would call it, between the parties, I think you're on the road to a resolution. A lot of what I'm saying will apply to other endeavours like what people these days call civil mediation. To my mind, it's not mediation at all when we're evaluating, where we're adjudicating, where we're arbitrating, where we're applying expertise to make an assessment of people's claims and defences and so on. For me, it's not mediation at all, but I would hope that some of what I'm saying might help practitioners of that discipline also to engage better with clients. And a lot of people involved in conflict do suffer temporarily or otherwise some compromise to their mental health. So although what I'm saying is not as applicable to those other quasi-mediation things like civil mediation, it's more applicable to interpersonal. And I think the key thing for us is try and learn about what's going on with the individuals you're working with. Learn from them. Take what we call a one-down position is how we would describe it in therapy. You're taking this position where you're actually learning from them. There's a very good book I read years ago in my training by Patrick Casement, C-A-S-E-M-E-N-T, called On Learning from the Patient, and it's an excellent description on how the practitioner learns from the clients that we work with and not the other way around. So that's first thing, appreciate that one size doesn't fit all. And then another lesson from, if you like, therapeutic practice that I really find very helpful, very valuable in mediation is this notion of balancing support and challenge. So when we have people come into mediation, it's inherently challenging. It's a really tricky thing. So we need to put a lot more support into the equation. So how do we support people? Well, support can come through the way that you relate to the client, which is my thing, I suppose, is showing empathy, showing this genuine, unconditional consideration for this party. They are who they are in the predicament they are in, they have the psychological predicament that they have. So can we show some sort of empathy and genuine, unconditional consideration for them? I think that can be extremely supportive and can be a unique experience. If somebody's been through the mill, if they're having a prolonged workplace dispute, prolonged neighbourhood dispute, prolonged commercial dispute, it's great to actually meet somebody who gets it and who gets how they are being impacted. So how we relate to the client can be very supportive. And I think that's where a lot of the support comes from. How the challenge comes into the equation, where the challenge comes from, is really with that person having to talk to their adversary at all. We know that in prolonged disputes, one of the defences that people demonstrate is just to avoid the other guy. Steer clear of them, book your opposite annual leave so you don't have to be around them, arrange your shift pattern so that you don't have to see them, ghost them, magically find a piece of paper to look at when you walk past them so you don't have to engage with them. So the avoidance is a common, as we know, defence against having to engage with an adversary. And then we bring them into mediation, particularly when it's face-to-face and not quite so much when it's online, as we've been doing for the last 15 months or so. This is hard work. This is a real challenge, you know, especially if you feel you're being blamed for what's gone wrong, if you're being told that you're the guy who's in the wrong, even if you're being accused of things, including lying or deceit. That's a really tough thing to have to take. So that's extremely challenging. So the reason I emphasise that is to say, you know, make sure we're putting a lot of support in there and make sure that when we're running mediations, we're going to try and moderate the challenge by our interventions. Don't go straight in there. You know, I would always and continually check people's needs and let them, again, another idea from therapy, let them scale the process up or down. So I would be saying things to people along the lines of, you know, is this too much for you? Is this okay for you? Do you want to hear from your colleague about XYZ incident? Do you want to wait a minute before you do that? Do you want to respond to them? So I'm scaling it the whole time. I'm thinking, how much can you take right now? How much can you take right now? Recognizing that to arrive in mediation at all is an inherently challenging endeavour. So I'm thinking, okay, this person with any predicament of mental ill health, they need this scaling. We can't just pile it on. We need to be careful and to moderate the challenge. Other practical ways of doing it are to use shuttle mediation, so we put people in separate rooms so they don't actually have to go eyeball to eyeball with the other person. And incidentally, even when we're doing online mediation, I have had our mediators have had several instances where a party doesn't even want to go online and appear on the same screen as their adversary. So they've wanted to use shuttle mediation, either with separate Zoom meetings or doing it on the telephone, so that we phone one, phone the other, phone one, phone the other. So sometimes people don't even want to meet on screen. It's tough, it's really tough. So an option is shuttle mediation, using a lot of breakouts. We can do breakouts on online mediation as well, of course. Shorter sessions, working for 35, 40 minutes at a time without a break. And encouraging the parties to ask for a pause or a chat with the mediator whenever necessary. Okay, so these are the moderating factors. These are the ways that we can just mitigate the challenge a little bit, just ease off the challenge a bit and load up the support if necessary. I'll just make a little point about that with support and challenge. If we have a lot of support in an endeavour like this, it's comfortable, it's more enabling, it feels easier to engage with. But the fact is, as mediators, we're trying to make something happen. We're setting up the conditions, should I say, for something to happen. And that thing is to get a resolution to a dispute. That's what we're there for. So I often think about starting with the end in mind, whether in the past with my therapy practice or with mediation practice. Start with the end in mind. Where do we expect to get to? What's possible? What could be achieved today in terms of resolving the dispute between these two individuals that I've got in front of me? And we need enough challenge that the job gets done, Because with only support, it's comfortable. Like I say, it may raise people's awareness. It may be a useful, it may be a conversation, but we don't necessarily get anywhere. But with too much challenge, it's just too scary. People will flee. People will get extremely defensive. People will not want to conclude the process. People will just shut down. People will act in bad faith and may even make agreements that they've got no intention of sticking to. So just be aware of how challenging it is and how much support is going in there. And it's about getting the balance right. So it's supportive enough to keep people engaged and make sure that we are meeting them where they are. And yet it's engendering enough challenge that actually we get the job done. The third thing I would say about this is now to work in the here and now of the session. We are looking at people's needs right now, and we know as mediators, I see we have a few people on who are trained mediators. You're very welcome to join us, by the way. And we know that the clients will want to tell us all about the history of their dispute. They want to tell us all about the history of their dispute. Fine, I'd probably do the same if I was going into mediation. We pay some mild interest to it as mediators, but mostly we're thinking about, okay, what could happen? How can things change? What's going to be different between these two people starting tomorrow? So they often will want to talk a lot about the past. We're wishing to set up the right conditions for them to move into a better future. And the bit we get in mediation is working in the here and now. So look at what they need from the other party and from the mediator right now. So this is what I mean by working in the here and now. And one of the ways we can do that is by thinking about, in terms of the two clients in the mediation, to say to one, what do you need from Terry just now? You know, what do you, one colleague, if it's a workplace, need from this other colleague just now? And they might say, well, I need this, I need understanding about X, Y, Z, I need an apology about A, B, C. I want them to appreciate that X, Y, Z. It might be something they need from the other party in terms of the dialogue. What are you telling Terry just now? So this is the other side of that coin. Do you want him to respond? How would you respond? What do you need to say to him? Are you ready to say a bit more about that? So these are very much present tense interventions to try and build the dialogue between the two parties. So it doesn't involve a recital of the history and the two different narratives about the history. It doesn't force them into the future, which in my experience, if we force people into the future in terms of making an agreement before they've thoroughly had the dialogue in the here and now, we end up with non-stick agreements. Okay, and what we want to end up with mediation is a genuine, good faith, sincerely entered into agreement that the two parties are going to stick to. And what I'm encouraging you to think about is working in the here and now of the session to make sure the dialogue happens, that people get what they need from the other individual in this moment of the strange set of conditions we set up in mediation, so that an agreement will emerge. We're not forcing agreements out of people in mediation. We're helping to set the conditions by which an agreement or action plan will emerge. That's why I say work in the here and now. Concentrate on what's going on in front of you. So our job is to knit the dialogue together. It's to set the conditions for them to have what I would call some psychological contact, even just for a moment. Even just for a moment. And when they've had that, they entertain the possibility that they could be having a better future. Okay, so the psychological contact, the moment of contact in the session, is the thing that we are aiming for. And the only other thing I'd say about here and now, and then I just want to turn to some comments. I was slightly distracted there by seeing some comments coming in. They do need to discharge and offload some of the past. They do need to have this dialogue and psychological contact in the present, and only then will they be ready to discuss what they need for the future. Okay, so that sort of pulls that point together. Thank you very much. A couple of comments coming in here. So Claire Anderson, hi Claire, is saying, an important point from Mike about not in caps, saying, I know how you feel. Quite agree, Claire. We never know how other people feel. I sometimes don't know how I feel. So I certainly don't know how other people feel from time to time. Comment from George Bryan. It's Patrick Casement. First name Patrick, surname Casement. I'll put a reference in the chat box a little bit further on, or we'll do a follow-up email. I can let you know about that. And the book is called On Learning from the Patient. It's a great text. It's one I relied on a lot in my training. And another one from Claire. Michael Nelson has confirmed for us. Patrick Casement. Cheers, Patrick. So it's in the chat. Michael's put it up for us. Claire says, while shuttle mediation ain't great, it's much better than not doing mediation at all. You bet, Claire. Yeah, I agree with that wholly. Yeah, I would say I find shuttle mediation a bit frustrating, a bit slow, a bit tedious, but it's better than not doing it at all. I absolutely agree, Claire. I think that's a very good point. Okay, we're doing well. This is what we can do. So then we're talking about the tie-up, really, between mediation and mental well-being. Let's think about how these things lead into one another. I think in practical terms, sometimes people's psychological predicament can lead them into conflict. That's another big topic. But the fact that somebody is withdrawn when they're in the office or in the neighbourhood or in the group, in the committee they're on, in the commercial setting they find themselves, they might be withdrawn, they might be a bit snappy with people, disinclined to engage, maybe a bit terse in how they give instructions, maybe they're slow to respond to approaches by other people, maybe they don't come over as very personable. We could, in our ignorance, if I may use that word, interpret this as somebody being unfriendly or cold. If we, however, realise that they have some mental ill health, we might be more sympathetic or understanding of the fact that they are interacting in that way. So people's psychological predicament will affect how they interact. It'll affect the warmth, the inclination to interact, their responsiveness, their preparedness to join in. And this can unfortunately lead people into conflict. And I mentioned earlier about people with personality disorders, or separately people who are on the autistic spectrum or who have Asperger's syndrome. And again, in our ignorance, we may interpret people's behaviour as being distant or cold or snappy, when in fact it's not that at all. So it might get you into conflict, the fact that you have a particular psychological predicament. And the other side of the coin is, the reason we have this loop here, is that taking part in mediation is quite difficult. It's quite difficult, and it can exacerbate psychological distress. It can even mean that people lose sleep, certainly mean that people lose sleep. I know the night before mediations, people are often telling me, I didn't sleep last night thinking about this. It's a really tricky thing to expect people to go into. So I think, having mental ill health can potentially lead you into conflict, depending on where you are, who's around you, how understanding they are. And also taking part in mediation can cause this psychological distress. So I think what's important in that regard, with that in mind, I think what we need to do is to normalise the use of counselling support for people taking part in mediation. There's several organisations where we've helped to set up in-house mediation services, and when people are invited into mediation, they are signposted towards the counselling service or to the employee assistance programme, or depending what other provision they've got, occupational health, or an in-house counsellor if they've got one. Normalise the use of counselling support. I wouldn't be surprised people taking part in mediation need somewhere to go and offload. We need a good understanding around confidentiality, of course, but it's a tricky thing to do, and I think it's fair enough if people want to get some counselling or psychological support while they're going through with mediation. Have a dialogue with your referrers, wherever the referral comes from, whether it's a housing provider, whether it's from a workplace, it might be a legal representative, it might be a family member, depending on what the mediation is. Check that people are okay to proceed, and also in the individual meeting you're making your own ad hoc assessment of whether people are okay to proceed, and let's not expect people to take part in mediation if they're not ready to do so. And as part of the mediation good practice and ethical practice, I think we should be thinking about signposting people to sources of support if necessary, and I've certainly signposted people to counselling services, etc. If I've thought that's appropriate. Got to be careful to, again, stay in the role of mediator. We're not advising, we're not suggesting, we're not diagnosing, we're not doing psychological assessments. But signposting, to me, could go as far as saying to somebody, do you know where you would go to get some support for this? Yeah, I do. Or if they said, no, I don't, I'd say, okay, so do you know who to ask to find out where you get some support for this? So this is what I mean by signposting. It's just turning people towards where they might avail of the kind of support that they would perhaps need. And also pay close attention to the principles of mediation. What do I mean by that? Well, what I'm saying is let's not forget what we're here to do. Again, we're not doing therapy, I say that a lot. We are working as mediators with an intention to get a resolution to a dispute. It works really, really well so long as we remember the principles that we work on. Confidentiality, we have to keep things private. Impartiality, we are not making any judgment or assessment about the outcome to a dispute, rights and wrongs, blames and faults. We are investing ourselves equally in both sides of an equation, investing ourselves equally in the interests of the two disputing parties. And we have to make sure that through our compassion for somebody who has mental ill health, that we're not losing that impartiality. And the third key building block for mediation is the voluntariness. So make sure people are there because they want to be there. And it can put us in a very, very difficult position if either as mediators we find that people have been told they've got to be there and this puts them in a bad place, or if we ourselves urge people to take part in mediation when really we should be valuing their own autonomy and their own ability to choose whether they take part or not. So I'm saying ultimately there is, lean back on the principles of mediation, lean back on the things that we know that make mediation work, and having this more acute awareness of mental health issues shouldn't compromise any of that. So I guess my closing comment really in terms of this webinar today is to say that, remember what mediation is for. We're here to try and get a resolution. We're trying to resolve a dispute, or we're trying to prevent the worsening of a dispute. Sometimes we get involved when the dispute's already happening, and our job is trying to head it off and make sure it doesn't get any worse or any deeper. It may be around complaints mediation. We do a lot of that, and we're finding quite a lot more of that coming through just now as people are getting back to work and as people are picking up the pieces following the pandemic and lockdown and furlough and so on. We might also be about repairing or restoring a relationship of whatever sorts, whether that's a neighbourly relationship, a working relationship, a commercial relationship, a family relationship. So this is what mediation is for. This is what we're here to do. We do need to have this acute awareness, in my opinion, around issues to do with mental well-being. But ultimately, as practitioners of mediation, whatever else we do, we just got to make sure that we do no harm. Okay, so to my colleague's delight, I've managed to keep this within 40 minutes or so, so it leaves a bit of time at the end for a few more questions. Thanks very much for your comments and your questions. We've got one here from Yelisa. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. People are actually very much afraid and get very tense before mediation. Indeed they do, and people will come in some states and people will call us before the mediation to talk things through. People will need a bit of encouragement. People may postpone. They may put the appointment off for quite a while. It's a nerve-wracking thing to come into mediation. It really is. I quite agree. Something from Claire there is about support could come through the employee assistance program, and I think that's a good for larger organisations, Claire, where they've got an EAP. Great. That's a really good place because they've got their referral mechanisms. They've got a good understanding about confidentiality and information sharing. So EAP is a good idea as a general point for where to refer people to. A question by email from Jennifer, who says, what do you do if it's clear that somebody's not in the right frame of mind to take part? How much do you tell the organisation when feeding back? Great question. It's all about consent. So with that individual for whom it's been suggested they try mediation and they turn up saying I'm here to try mediation, and in my opinion they don't have that functional capacity that I was talking about. We can say they haven't got capacity, but you need to just dig down into that a little bit and think, okay, can they engage? Can they take turns in a conversation? Do they entertain the notion of being able to reach an agreement, etc., etc., all the things I said. And then with their consent, I would want to speak to the referrer about that. Ideally, I would have a three-way conversation with the individual, the referrer and me in order to make a decision about whether to go ahead with mediation. So it's a great question, but it comes down to consent, it comes down to autonomy. It comes down to making sure that we're operating inclusively and that we are not blanket denying entry into mediation to people who have mental ill health. Because as I hope I've got the point over today, it's not one thing. So I think we need to think functionally, think about whether that person can fully engage with the mediation, have a conversation with consent with the referrer and that party, and have a three-way dialogue to decide how we can allow that person to avail of what mediation has to offer. A question from Hope. I'll just take this one and then we'll move on. What would you advise for a colleague with mental health issues who's gone through mediation multiple times with the same person and the agreement never seems to stick? That's a really interesting question. They weren't ready to make an agreement, or it was the wrong agreement, or perhaps we don't need to look at it in terms of reaching an agreement but having a good dialogue. There doesn't have to be a highfalutin written agreement at the end of mediation, and it's sort of, we have a bit of a laugh around here about people quoting settlement rates in mediation. You know, one firm will say we do 95% success, another one will say we do 98%, somebody does 100% mediation success, which to me is fantasy island, that one. It's not about the number of agreements you get, it's about how many times you preclude the need for any further action or any formal action, a court case, a grievance, a tribunal, or an eviction proceeding. Okay, it's about the number of times we resolve a dispute to the extent that no further action is required. We don't need to count the number of agreements we get. It does make me laugh, really, because it's not about that. So maybe the parties in that question, Hope, didn't need to reach an agreement. Maybe they didn't have to write down an agreement. Perhaps they weren't ready to make an agreement. Maybe there's a little too much impetus from the mediator to get an agreement, when really that wasn't within their wishes. Okay, great questions. Thank you very much. So, just a couple of things to mention before we finish for today. You're always welcome to join us on these webinars. We love doing them and we love having your attendance and participation. There's a link there which my colleague will put in the chat box as well for how to find out about webinars. Just going to mention a couple. Friday 21st of May. We will be looking at building resilient teams. So this is about when teams need a bit more support to address conflict, or look at some bad habits within the teams, or look at their decision-making capacity. We do a lot of that within organisations of all shapes and sizes. So we'll be looking at that as quite a bit of a contrast to what we're talking about today, really looking at more about facilitation than mediation, but how you work with teams using these skills. There's more on the link on the website. The link is appearing in the chat box just now. Do keep in touch with us. You can like and subscribe our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, check out our LinkedIn, or have a look at our Facebook page as well. Delighted to be with you this afternoon. Some further comments coming in. I'll have to leave those for now. Do keep in touch. Good to be with you this afternoon. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.